COVID-19 and the disproportionate impact on communities of color and other marginalized communities. I'm Brenda Siegel. I'm running for Lieutenant Governor, and I'm here today with Keisha Ram and Stefan Gillum, and we'll introduce you to them in a second. I am really excited to open up a conversation about this topic across the state, and hopefully folks are watching also in other parts of the country. We do need to center historically marginalized voices when we're creating policy, or when we're really focusing on issues, especially around health and health impact. And I want to make sure that we have those conversations in a really meaningful way whenever we have the opportunity to, and whenever we have a microphone to do so. So I am using my microphone right now to make sure that we have this conversation. I also want to just reach out to, there's people on this call I can see right now who reached out to me in the last week after I experienced an anti-Semitic attack, and I want to thank you. We do have really good security on this event, so I want to assure you that we are on it, and that generally our team is being very vigilant, but more importantly, we have called for all people holding campaign events of any kind to have strong security measures in the future, because that is not acceptable. We do need to have historically marginalized voices in leadership, and in order to do that, we need to ensure that there is a safe and secure space with which to have meaningful conversations and get our ideas out. So that does not mean not open, in case there's anybody watching that feels that way. They're open is different than not safe and secure. So now that we've gotten that out of the way, I want to introduce you to Keisha Ram and give her a second to introduce herself. But she is currently running for Chittenden County Senate. She has served 4 terms in the Vermont House of Representatives on behalf of Burlington. She was the vice chair of the House Natural Resources and Energy Committee, as well as the clerk of the General Housing and Military Affairs Committee, and a member of Ways and Means Committee. In 2018, she graduated from Harvard Kennedy School of Government with a master's in public administration, and she focused on economic and health equity. She currently serves as a senior fellow at the Center of the Whole Communities and consults with agencies and towns, school districts, and nonprofits to build welcoming, diverse, and equitable communities. She has worked at the city of Burlington as the civic engagement specialist and for steps to end domestic violence, and I'm sure she'll bring some of this in here tonight as well, as the legal advocacy director. She also serves on the boards of Planned Parenthood, Northern New England, and the Vermont Natural Resources Council. So I want to give Keisha a minute to introduce herself beyond what I just said.
Well, thanks so much, Brenda, for that very kind introduction. And sorry, as some people know, I actually am recovering myself from what may have been symptoms of COVID-19, and there are recurring challenges clearing your throat, so bear with me. But I want to thank you, Brenda, for that very kind introduction, for having a platform like this, for all the great work you've been doing, and for not shutting down in any way after a really painful and frightening anti-Semitic experience. Before I move on to anything else, it's just worth noting that there have been so many Zoom bombing experiences that affect women, people of color, people of a certain faith, particularly Jewish faith, and that in and of itself is a form of disparity when people have to think just as much about being traumatized, trying to learn or to have a conversation or to engage as they are able to engage around the topics. So, it is, again, I heard someone say, for the people who spend so much time thinking about how to be racist and go to the length of bombing a Zoom meeting and, exposing themselves or putting up really offensive images, we have to be that anti-racist to combat that. And that really stuck with me. Like, people are out there working working really hard to spew hate, and we have to work really hard to bring people together, and that takes a lot of effort. So I appreciate people being here tonight. I guess that's really what I wanted to say. I'm just, it was great to be with you before, Brenda, talk about opioids, and I'm particularly honored to be on a platform alongside Stefan, because I've heard incredible things, and I just was really excited to hear from him tonight. I guess I'll just say I didn't include any resources because I think this conversation could take so many different go so many different places. There's so many disparities to choose from, and there's articles about the slow response in Vermont. There's a multitude of articles about environmental health disparities, existing preconditions for people, their lack of access to testing or health care. So I could give a mountain of resources to people. So depending on where things go, I'm happy to share some links in the chat box as we continue.
Thank you, Keisha. And I forgot to say also, Keisha is a friend. I gave you all of her. And I'm really thrilled to be here with you as well and have regular conversations about topics just as off and on the way.
That's a zipper that you just destroyed.
I also want to introduce another friend of mine, Stefan.
Thank you, buddy.
And he is a practitioner
That's not a
of
dog
conflict
toy.
resolution, an activist, an educator, and an AmeriCorps Vista service alum. Most recently, the bulk of his activism work is through the NAACP, where he currently serves as the president of the Windham County branch of the NAACP. He is currently pursuing his PhD in couples and family therapy. And I want to say that one of the things that Stefan and I just talked about leading up to this run for Lieutenant Governor was how we are going to center these conversations, which are so important, and how we're going to ensure in a midst of chaos when you're running for office that we don't lose this piece, because losing this piece is unacceptable and it gets lost over and over and over again. And so I'm really grateful that Stefan could join us today, and I'll give him a second to introduce himself.
Hello. First of all, it's good to hear your voice, Brenda, and it's good to see you as well. Keisha, it's been a long time. I don't think I've seen you since, it's been a couple years in person, a long time ago, at a dinner, I think. It was the after thing at a dinner. So good to see you. Thanks for that introduction, Brenda. And I'm also, sad to hear that you went through, that anti-Semitic attack. And so I'm glad that you've come out on the other side of that, and that's all going well now. And obviously it shows how resilient you are as a practitioner and what you're doing. So like you said, my name is Stefan Gillum. I am currently serving as the president of the Windham County branch of the NAACP. There are 2 branches currently in Vermont of the NAACP, and ironically, even though the NAACP had been around since 1909, which is more than 100 years ago, we didn't actually get NAACP nothing onto our soil until about 2015, I believe. So it was a long time coming for the NAACP, and it's still been a challenge to keep it here, but at least we're here now, right? So that's pretty much me. I like to keep it short and sweet and simple. There's so many more things that I could go into, projects that I am part of with the NAACP, but just in my own personal capacity on different types of boards and advisory boards and committees and town this and town that. But I'm so excited to come here today and to talk to you about this topic. And also, I'm so happy that we have expanded this topic a little bit outside of Vermont, because I think that there is this kind of island feel sometimes that we have here, and that it's not necessarily, in my opinion, always the best thing, right? And some other states that we go to, are a little bit more connected to the neighbors as far as the connected narratives go, the dominant discourses go. And I think that some of that might actually be just because of our demographics, right? I mean, if you have a lot of marginalized people in one community, and across the board you have another large group of marginalized people that actually are represented, then you'll have that solidarity And that's something that I see happening in Vermont, but I wish it would happen more. So I'm so happy to be here to talk about that, and also to talk about, of course, COVID and the impacts. And I'm hoping to add to the conversation not only with statistics, because we can do that all day, but I'm hoping, and the reason why I showed up today was to have a conversation that was just sort of real and have a bit of real talk about just how we've seen it impacting people's lives. So some of it might be anecdotal, but I'm okay with that. And I think that's okay because, you know, that's what we do. So thanks.
Hi, everyone. So I just wanted to let you know, we just saw that thank you so much, Stefan. I just want to address that on some computers, you have to grab the link and then put it into another tab in order to use it if you want to sign in. One of the reasons we're having people sign in is that if something does go wrong, we will be able to address you and get you back on into a safe and secure setting again. So please do sign in if you can. I also want to let people know that are watching on our YouTube, on Progressive Insiders YouTube, on our Facebook or Progressive Insiders Facebook or anyone else's Facebook, please, one, share it. And two, if you want to come in and ask questions in real time, we're going to put the link in so you can register and come in. You'll be an attendee. You won't be up on the panelist, so nobody will see you right now, but it will allow you to ask questions in the chat box. The two places we're monitoring questions outside of the chat box here is on our Facebook page, Brenda Siegel for Vermont, and on Progressive Insiders YouTube page. So if you are wanting to ask questions, then those are good places to watch so that it's monitored. Whether or not anyone else wants to monitor their own pages and bring questions up is totally fine. So I want to start by saying that Keisha and I worked together on I approached Keisha and we worked together on a petition, which we'll put up, to help secure the prison population. And we're kind of jumping ahead a little, and we'll talk about this again later, but I just want to let you all know, because for a variety of reasons. But one of the reasons that we were brought to this was that in Vermont, we have a very high racial disparities in our prison population. So we are in the top 5 in the country for racial disparities in our prison population. And COVID as a whole, it's been widely reported, is disproportionately impacting communities of color. So by not offering the right protections, which we should anyways in a prison population, we are participating in that disproportionate impact on communities of color. And so that also had me think a lot more about this conversation and how important it is. I also am really frustrated when I just like all of you probably click on the news and see that a black man died of COVID who asked for a test and didn't get a test, or asked to be hospitalized and was dismissed. So we want to be really clear that that's not acceptable. And there's some of it is we would say is because of underlying health issues, but we have to get into why are there those underlying health issues, and we have to get into why are doctors not listening, and we have to have a more broad conversation about who is harmed health-wise, and then we have to have a more broad conversation about who is being harmed economically. And so I could not think of two better people to bring in, although there are lots of incredible people that we could have brought into this conversation, and I'm hoping to have a really broad conversation about all of this. So I am going to go ahead and go the other way and start with Stefan and see if you want to talk a little bit about the work that you've been doing around this and the conversation that you want to see happening. And for attendees, you can put questions in the question and answer or in the chat box. There will be a time when we actually ask about questions, and so don't get frustrated if we don't answer right away. We will come back to those questions in a little bit.
Yeah, so thanks again for the introduction. Everyone let me know if you can hear me all right. I know that I don't talk the loudest, and I am originally from the Midwest and South, so I don't talk the fastest either, but I'll try to speed it up for everybody. So, yeah, the kind of work that we've been doing, well, there's so many things. I guess I could start with kind of what we've been doing most recently. Well, by participating in things like this, we've also participated in other community forums. Actually, we just had one with Lisa Sparrow, who is a local pastor here in Windham County, and she had a global concert that we were able to be part of. So we're trying to kind of keep it fun and friendly in some ways, and really speak to that area of things. Obviously, our biggest concern though has been around data collection, and up until recently, we had not seen much collection, really any collection of data that parsed out race or ethnicity or anything like that happening in the state of Vermont until about 3 weeks ago, when they, I think, started to collect it. And so Tabitha Moore, who is the president of the Rutland branch of the NAACP, and I got together and crafted 2 letters, one to people of color in Vermont and one to providers. And to the people of color, we were urging them to disclose their racial data, which is something that historically we have not necessarily done as a people of color, right? Especially Black folks, because of a plethora of reasons around discrimination. But we know now, given the disparities that are happening with the COVID pandemic and the discrimination and just all of it, that we needed to have that data here in Vermont, because every time that we seem to look at our data in Vermont and relative to Black and brown folks, it never looks that great. So we needed to know what was happening on the ground here so that we could advocate in the best way possible. And so that was pretty much sums up our letter to people of color. Our letter to providers was pretty much asking them to collect that data. A lot of times we found, or I found just through having conversations with healthcare people and providers, that they sometimes don't feel comfortable asking those questions, or they shy away from those questions because of maybe 1 or 2 bad responses that they've had, which is something that I say is slightly understandable, but is also not really the greatest excuse, because people's lives can be on the line. And in Vermont, we do have a decent population of people who identify as folks of color, right? Black, brown, indigenous, you name it. And so we were really asking for that data to be collected and urging for its collection to be released in a systematic way that made sense, right? So not just like releasing it in some data solid, but actually being able to produce descriptive statistics that make sense. And we've been fairly successful on that, and we've worked alongside Susanna Davis, Mark Hughes from Justice for All, and the Vermont ACLU. And I actually think it was Mark Hughes and the Vermont ACLU, they put out a letter asking for the data right before we put out our 2 letters. So we've all been working in tandem with Susanna on that, and we've produced pretty good results. I mean, the last I checked, I think 92% of the data has been collected now. So the Vermont Department of Health actually went back and collected a lot that they had not collected before. And so we've been successful on that front. I would also say that one thing we've been doing is that we've been communicating with our membership bases, and we've been calling for them to do things like support the Asian community, right? And that could look like something as small as, when you ordering from a business that might be dealing with discrimination at this time, because we do have, unfortunately, messages from certain leaders in our country that sounds or could lead to discrimination against the Asian community. And so we've gotten pretty good responses there. So those are some of the things that we've pretty much been doing. I would say overall, my mind and my agenda kind of focuses on 3 things. So first of all, the economic impact. Second of all, what I call is like the peace of mind impact. Nobody really talks about that, but obviously me coming from a mental health background and point of view, I'm concerned about that. And also just a statistical background, as well. So, and what I mean by economic impact, right, is like not only talking about data in the way that it impacts people of color, as far as like saying, oh, more people of color have been impacted by COVID than anyone else because of A, B, C, D, and E. Actually getting on the ground and saying, how are they being impacted? One example that I could use just right off the bat, that's totally anecdotal, but I love anecdotal stuff and I don't even care. That's totally anecdotal, is that I know a person who tried their best to advocate for themselves to not go into a COVID-related zone. I mean, they are in the healthcare field. They had a lot of people in their particular area that were impacted. And when they advocated for themselves, they were told that they could not do that. And they ended up having to get into pretty much a policy match, as we're going to call it, right? Looking at policies, figuring out who was right, who was wrong, what they could and could not do to advocate for themselves, which caused a lot of mental stress and also economic stress as well on this person, who then had to turn around and use their union to fight for them. But what does that lead to? That leads to discrimination on the job, because now you're on the side of the union, now you've gone against your bosses, and there are things like that that happen every day that we're not really talking about. So it's one thing to talk about, what's happening to people when they hit the emergency room, because it's so important, but it's another thing to talk about people's peace of mind and how it's impacting their mental health as well, and these everyday situations that are impacting pretty much every Black and brown person's life at this point, systematically, some way or the other.
Yeah, I want to say that I think that's extremely important. I thought a lot about that as we're reopening, I think a little bit unsafely, and feeling a little bit frustrated, because what that really means is that poor people and historically marginalized people are going to be going back to work and not have a choice because they can't collect unemployment anymore. And so they can't necessarily advocate for themselves and stay home. There are some exceptions, but people can't take that risk often. And so I've really been concerned about what we're doing in terms of that, because it is really hard on people's mental health to say I don't feel safe, and yet I can't go home. Just before this, I was on a call with somebody who was summoned back to the office yesterday today, and they got there and nobody was wearing masks at all, and people were sitting very close to her, and she felt very uncomfortable. So she eventually decided advocate for herself, but that could go the wrong way, and so I think we do have to talk pretty openly about what we're actually doing here. I'm going to give Keisha time now to talk about
only if you want to.
What she'd like to talk about this issue.
Thank you, and Stefan hit so many high notes. I think, it's hard to know where to start, but I think in Vermont, the experience was watching a lot of Blacker and browner cities in the country and feeling this sense of shock and shame for America. How do Madison and Chicago and Detroit and Atlanta, how do these cities and states have such a deep disparity that 70 to 80% of the cases
Thank you so
are
much.
Black Americans? That a majority of people, unfortunately, in body bags now are Black and brown people in the country. And at the same time that we're all watching that happen around the country, we're not even collecting the information in Vermont to know what's going on here. And so, you have to also give some credit to communities that are demonstrating what the disparity is. That's a big part of the battle, is to know what's happening and who's being affected. Otherwise, you can't make good policy or good healthcare decisions. I put some of the data that, folks like Tabitha and Stefan fought so hard to get more of in the state up in the chat box. It's a link to the latest demographic information about who's affected in Vermont. We're going to have, with just 54 cases, one case, is a whole story. But also we know that was one life. That was one person that was taken from us, too soon in an agonizing way. And we have to ask ourselves, lot of points where I had to advocate for myself before I got into that emergency room, that I can see someone who doesn't speak English or isn't used to the healthcare system or doesn't have, a voice or a appearance that seems so sympathetic to somebody on the other end who's gatekeeping, that they would hit a lot of barriers and not be able to get care. What we know from that information is that Vermonters who identify as white are exactly almost proportionally represented in the cases, but they're slightly underrepresented in who's died. So of the 54 cases, 6 people who have died identify as not white, either biracial or Asian in this case.
Let's place the full cup of coffee.
You had the Asian community slightly underrepresented in positive cases, but overrepresented then by having 2 deaths. And you have right now the small Black community in Vermont, just proportionally small Black community, overrepresented in terms of.
I feel like this table is lower, but the chairs are higher.
And then you have 4 biracial people identified as biracial passed away. I have been worried from the beginning that we're only going to look in retrospect at the healthcare information, who didn't get tested, who didn't have someone advocating for them and helping them, what connections they didn't have. And we have the opportunity to write that with the economic recovery and how equitable that is, and we're already on a path where I don't think we're going to see any better or quicker of a response on that front. You could see coming how long it took to get information in other languages to people about basic healthcare information. You had a couple families who sent their kids to school, not realizing that schools had been shut down in the Burlington area. And so, right away I emailed folks like Susanna and Ted and others in Agency of Commerce and state government and said, what are we doing to get economic information out in other languages? As we know, and I was just on the phone with the EPA today to say there's like this 2-week lag because we hear something from the federal government. We don't know if it's accurate or not. We test the assumptions of what we can do, like getting on the phone and getting help. We learn what's working and not working. And then we start the process of interpreting it into other languages, and that's an incredible lag. And what we know from before the crisis, and I have some research I'd be happy to share with people, is, when people, when we look back at loans and access to capital in the state, when people have sought access to capital for a small business, we have a number of women entrepreneurs and entrepreneurs who identify as New American that we should be celebrating. Just like the rest of the country, we have a lot of women small business owners, and it's proportionally even more so. About a third of women in Vermont identify as entrepreneurs, and about double our proportional population of New Americans identify as business owners.
Yeah, none of my women in here.
Overrepresented in New American business owners, which is great. Immigrants bring a lot to the table. They create trillions of dollars in wealth in the businesses that they start. Yet, if you look back at the institutions that are supposed to serve those organizations,
Whoever's making noise in the kitchen is making noise louder than Keisha.
They've represented, for people of color, less than 2% of access to capital and the loans given out. For women, still far, they're about a third of the entrepreneurs in the state. They get about 9% of the revenue.
I don't know who he's talking about.
So, we have these huge gaps that are only going to get worse if people aren't in the front of the line getting access to, UI, PPP, EIDL, all these programs. It's an alphabet soup of really complicated programs. And you have to know people, unfortunately. You have to be able to stay on the phone and speak to someone in your own language. So, we're really in for it. I posted another link that to me was helpful because I think it's a really good illustration of four of the major reasons that the Black community is harder hit. I think it's
chili or soup.
It's important to admit to ourselves, and not being a Black identifying American myself. Like I just want to help bridge with white people who don't understand that this isn't because of poor life choices. This isn't because people just were not paying attention to social distancing. For the reasons that they illustrate, I think are really important for people to think about. A lack of access to health care, being, as Stefan said, the workers who are often on the front lines and aren't given the sympathy to take time off or distance themselves from being on the front lines. A lack of access to clear information. You even had the Black Surgeon General. We have our first Black Surgeon General in the middle of a pandemic taking Black lives. stop the barbecues, and not giving people real clear healthcare information that they deserve. And
I gotta go
an
hear what
issue
he's
that's
talking
really near and
about.
dear to my heart. You have disproportionality in who is experiencing environmental health impacts. People who grow up with asthma, people who live near an old dry cleaning site in a place like Vermont or an asbestos mine, or in another part of the country they live near a refinery, or have bad air quality in their neighborhoods, and they have asthma, they have heart conditions, they have respiratory illness. They're going to be the ones who get the ventilator taken away from them in Detroit, get rationed health care when they've already had a compromised system. So get off my soapbox now, but these disparities are huge and deep, and it's something we need to talk about. So that's why I appreciate this conversation.
Did bring you here to be on a soapbox. That's okay. I just got a note from Jacob that people are saying it's hard to hear for some reason.
Oh, okay.
But it's not. I can hear fine, so it might be what's going through on Facebook. I think must be what he means. So just so Carrie knows, there's some. I think something going on there. We'll do the best we can.
I can hear a little bit better for some odd reason when I take my computer off mute. I don't know why. That's not usually the case, but maybe.
Okay.
Off mute, but.
And Carolyn says she hears great, not on Facebook. So I think it must be what's going on at Facebook. So just whatever's happening there, if we can adjust. I don't know if there's a way, but if there is, please do it. So I wanted to just say that one of the things that also brought me to this conversation was I have been listening to the governor's press conferences when I can, and I at one point heard our commissioner of health, and he was talking about. It was a little earlier on, but he was talking about how many people of color had died, and he just said, "Well, it's not a big number; it's only 2." And my immediate thought was, now that is not an accurate. That is not an accurate way to give that data, because unless you understand how many people were sick with the disease, and how, like Keisha was talking about, and proportionately how many people died, you don't really understand what that impact is on communities of color in our state. Also, when you look at the prison population, you have to also look at how many people were impacted there, and how many people were impacted who were people of color, and many of whom had sentences that were disproportionate to their white counterparts for the same crime, and so or the same what we call crimes, and so I think that we
detention facilities where
right.
people's the disproportionality of their sentence versus the crime of crossing a border, which is a civil offense, is huge.
Right. Yes, detention facilities as well. And I think that's why migrant justice is really calling for people to be released from detention facilities right now, and there is outbreaks in them. And there is outbreaks in prisons across the country, and we have not taken the proper precautions. And as Keisha and I said in our petition, COVID-19, like a prison sentence is not a COVID-19 death sentence. People are not being sentenced to that, and so we do need to make a real distinction about the treatment and care that people get. These are human beings
who are often sentenced disproportionately to white counterparts, and for that matter are often even just arrested in the first place disproportionately, and certainly in our state. And so we do want to, I think, make a really clear distinction. And also talking about all of these other pieces where we do need to discuss how people are getting care, how they're administering care, how they got care in the first place, what the lack of health care for communities of color may have caused the impact of this to some extent, and acknowledge that there's plenty of white people not socially distancing like they're supposed to be right now. This is not because people are making the wrong choices, as Keisha said. I want to give both of you a chance, if you feel like you are able to give like, what do you think some solutions to this, or going forward, how do we create a more stable setting, a more stable structure, because this is a systemic problem, and systemic problems are people created and can be people fixed. So how do we create that structure in a different way going forward? I'll start with whoever wants to start first.
Do you want to go, or? Okay, great.
You go ahead. Go ahead.
Okay, I'll give Stefan time to gather his thoughts. So, if you just look at the article that I shared about 4 reasons the Black community particularly is hit so hard, let's take one that I think is, fairly easy, nothing's easy, but, one that I think we could do a better job of right away, not having access to clear information. I'm working right now on with the Department of Health and other foundations, hopefully, to understand who's digitally underserved in this crisis, and that is, new Americans, migrant farm workers, seniors, people without access to the internet, potentially some people with disabilities who don't have the same assistive technology that they would need to participate. So, the list can go on, but there's a lot of low-hanging fruit to make government information more accessible, and I hope this crisis has demonstrated how important that is. Number one, I am glad to see the legislature looking at access to the internet as a basic government service, as something that everyone needs in case of emergency or to participate. Two, there are a lot of ways that people try to communicate with groups and get information that we're not kind of plugged into. For example, WhatsApp is a really popular way for people to get information from family, friends, internationally for free. And a lot of governments around the world have broadcast channels through WhatsApp where they try to get information to people. I don't know about, other counties. I hate to sound like such a, Chittenden County person, but in Chittenden County, across the county, we have an emergency alert system. And so you can find out if there's a pipe that's broken. You can find out if, there's an accident on 89. And I wrote to Mayor Weinberger and said, why is my alert so quiet right now? Like, I get there's not as many accidents happening. I get maybe hopefully some pipes aren't bursting. But we're in the middle of a pandemic. How come this thing isn't telling me useful information? How come it can't be used in other languages? Like, what is going on? So a lot of our tools, we need to think differently now that we've been through this, and hopefully do a much better job just with access to information. As Stefan said before, I mean, just the challenge of culturally changing how we collect information and how we have open conversations about race in New England is a huge challenge for us. I was on the House floor when we were debating how you collect race information in police stops and how important that is to understanding the disparities that are happening in the state. And, talked about my own experience being arrested when I was 13, and the questions were, are you Mexican? Are you sure you're not Mexican? And trying to help other legislators understand, like, that's a time when they could have just written down whatever they thought I was, and that would have been really valuable information to changing the system. We experience it. It doesn't have to be sad. We know what's happening, and we just need it to be articulated in a safe, comfortable way, because this is just as important as our age category or our gender. And frankly, those are some areas where we also have a long way to go. So, collecting information about folks should be made much more commonplace, and we need to get over that hurdle. And then we need to do something with that information. We need to recognize the disproportionality. I hope I'm on boards. Every organization I'm on, I've said, Planned Parenthood, whatever, Vermont Natural Resource Council, we should come out of this advocating for universal health care and an end to racial disparities in healthcare. I mean, if those aren't the paradigms we shift after this, we're missing the opportunity to come out of this in any way a stronger country and a stronger society. So the more organizations you're involved with, that you can just say, what is our big picture takeaway, and how do we work toward that? Because this is our moment. The world has stopped and started to pay attention to these inequities, disparities, and the desperate need everyone has, the right they should have to healthcare, and how do we answer that call?
Thank you. That was great, and I think that's all right on. And I did there was something that you really pulled. Oh, that Mark Hughes on Justice for All did put together data that had been requested by the legislature, but not the right data came out of it, or not data that was useful or usable. And he pulled it from Justice for All. So I'm going to see if we can pull it and put it in the chat box and in the Facebook live stream for folks about, and just click on your area, click on your town, click on your county, and it's appalling how people are pulled over in our state. Actually, it's pretty upsetting, and so I think that's the kind of data we really need in order to make the changes. And in terms of, we need a people's bailout. We need a people-centered society, and this is our moment. So I'm just gonna echo that call. If you, whatever boards you're on, whatever groups, whatever organizations you're part of, if you can make sure that you loud and clear say that we need a people's bailout, we need universal health care, we need to center people from here forward. We now know that, even if we didn't before, for those of us that didn't before. We're going to need to start now. We can't wait until afterwards, because people have very short memory spans, and we don't want to come out of this not having been screaming this from the rooftops. Which is part of the reason we're having this conversation. Now I'm giving Stefan an opportunity to say what he thinks needs to happen from here forward.
Well, I can say that, for people who are consider themselves leaders or who considered leaders, I think it's best that you consult with your networks. I think that's the most important thing that we could be doing right now as far as advocacy goes. One thing that I know I've been doing is I've been consulting with the other young presidents within the NAACP. There isn't that many actually truly younger presidents. I mean, like 45 and under is very young for the NAACP. So consulting with them and seeing, what they're doing, and also the older presidents as well. But just having those consortiums of people who are your peer groups and who are also active, so that you can kind of create those multi-city, tri-city, rural, urban connections, and really understand the connectiveness of all of this, and have a holistic approach to what you're doing in your own area. That's the biggest one. I think Keisha hit a lot of stuff on the head. I think another one is paying attention to mental health and actually allowing people who are not okay to be not okay, giving them that space, realizing that, like, a lot of people of color right now are feeling extremely inundated. Because, like I said before, a lot of their lives, economically, politically, socially, have been impacted. And yet again, this is another situation where it feels like everyone is talking about us, but we're not really at the table to have the conversation, right? And there's all this data being thrown around, but anybody who knows anything about data knows that it's always behind, right? We're talking about a curve. To run a regression, you need to have, adequate data, but that's always catching up to something. And so when your life is on the line, or when you're in a job where you might be, an EMT or working in healthcare or something like that, in a grocery store or whatever, where you see predominantly Black and brown folks, and a lot of times white folks, working class white people and poor white folks as well, in these jobs, it can be really challenging to, be talked about in this way. So allowing people to have their moment. And I think that is something that's very low to the ground that we don't think about, but that's important. I think it's also important that folks of color especially listen to leaders who look like you. They, a lot of times, not all the time, we have a few examples that we could cite, but most of the time, they do have your best interests at heart, right? I'm thinking back to Georgia and how the governor there wanted to just, release everyone, and how a lot of the leaders of color there said no. They came out and spoke to the people there, and they said that is not in our best interests. We are a heavily African American state, and we know that if that happens, that we are going to be the ones who are the most impacted. And so I would say to other folks, try to use try to listen to those more common sense leaders who actually have your best interests in mind. And I think that leads to this conversation about, like, dominant discourses, and the fact that, like, a lot of times white men are controlling these narratives and what is happening, even the way we're interpreting data. And so if it's possible to be able to even look through that and try to see past that. I also think one thing that we could be doing, and I think everyone should do, is to know our history, right? If we know a little bit of our history, we know who's usually impacted when things like this happen. We know whose voices, whose bodies are used as platforms, right? Economic platforms, political platforms. And so being able to speak to that, being able to know where we stand in that, is something that I know I hold as a person of color, as a Black person. But I also think that as a leader, we could be doing to educate our communities more about, not saying that they don't know, a lot of them do, but they don't necessarily know where to find the resources all the time. And I also think that it's important for the different diasporas, right? The Asian diaspora, the Black diaspora, um, just as two examples, to be supporting each other. And during these times, I think there is a lot of rhetoric out right now that seeks to separate us. That's more divisive than anything else, and it's important that we speak to that as well, right? Um, so that's really my biggest points. I think that Keisha did a great job talking about the data and everything else like that, and yeah, it sounds pretty holistic. So
I just really want to underscore what Stefan said about mental health supports, particularly for those who haven't had the ability to access that before, how important that is alongside, being able to access other types of healthcare. I think, if a lot of people really search within themselves, there are folks who of privilege who are saying, I really need to go back to therapy, or I need to sort of explore what's going on for me right now. I'm spending a lot of time with my partner or alone. I've had this real immense privilege and just window into the lives of some folks in Connecticut who are really struggling. I'm doing a project with the Universal Healthcare Foundation of Connecticut, and there's some Black men who are part of the group who have talked about their time in prison and coming out of prison and now being in their houses, and after you spend 20 years in prison and you're sitting in your house and all the things that you're trying to sort out within yourself in quarantine, that's really intense. And being able to say, I don't know how to afford mental health services. I don't know where to find a Black counselor. I'm experiencing trauma, and I don't know where this trauma is coming from. If it's new, if it's old, if this is the same thing we've always been going through, and I don't even know how to ask for help. And so, with anyone in your life, but particularly people who might not have taken the time in the past or had the resources in the past to access mental health supports, those are going to be really, really important to people as they, come out of this quarantine and out of this crisis, thinking about what they're experiencing. And those are resources we need to make more available. It's going to be just as important as other forms of healthcare.
and one thing I can add just as a resource is that if you look at wherever you're at, I know that we used to have some programs in Vermont. I don't know if they're still around with the recent college transitions that just happened, but I assume that they might be. But I know that in a lot of our bordering states like New Hampshire and Massachusetts, that any student clinic is mainly income-based. Those people are trying to get their hours, and they see people for as little as $5 a session, sometimes free. I know that they have a lot of deals for the COVID right now that say we will give you 4 free sessions to start off with, pretty much a month for free. And that is something that I know that the Antioch Clinic, just over the border from us in Windham in New Hampshire, does. The Antioch Marriage and Family Therapy Institute does that. And I think that the Antioch Psychological Services Center has a similar deal going on. So there are very practical ways to attain these services right now, and I do know that all of them have switched over to telehealth options. It's there. It's just really about knowing folks, and that again, that access issue, knowing folks who can get you where you need to go. But these things are here. Just not a lot of people of color being able to access them.
And thank you for going into that field, Stefan, because you're needed, and there's just a dearth of people who might look like you and can speak to your experiences, and so what you're doing is really important. People travel to other states to get mental health supports and other supports from people who might understand their experience a little better.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
I'm very much enjoying this conversation. I want to relay a couple of things that Carolyn has put up. The most recent is that in Mad River Valley groups have been have many volunteers calling people, and is not that kind of community going on elsewhere in Vermont? Well, it does depend a little bit on where you are in the state as to how much that's happening. Our campaign has been calling people, thousands of people throughout the last month. And some of it is that people are uncomfortable saying that they need something. And so we really do have to be willing to stay on the phone long enough to develop that relationship, so that people can understand that you really are calling to ask if they need something and help them find the resources for it. And so if we're calling just to check in and we don't put that time and energy into it, then I'm not sure that we're doing the good that we need to be doing. So I think that for other people, perhaps we have to be more cautious of doing that for other people. And then also, again, it depends on what community you're in. So, for example, in Windham County, actually, the Windham County Democrats are doing some of these calls, but I would say that Brattleboro does have more of that going on. However, I live out in the country, and there is a lot less of it. So you're not necessarily mining our rural communities. So when then you start to get into how that impacts people in poverty a lot, because, for example, in Essex County, the median income is $10,000 less than everywhere else in the state. So we do really want to look, I think, in a broader way about those phone calls. So I think that's a really important point. But then she brought up a couple of other questions that I think both of you could get to a little bit and have a little bit, but maybe even more. That I don't know where we were in the conversation, but she agreed, but the application of information is difficult to find for elder and marginalized people. They need to find who to be contacted by people, who to advocate, social workers, skilled community members, and also that people need advocates. Yeah. And we're not necessarily, we don't have necessarily advocates. And I know that as someone who does have access to some of our higher up officials, I often feel like one of my jobs right now and always is to connect to people who don't, so that I can create some of that connection. But that's not how it ever should be. We should be able to, people should be able to access what they need without having those connection to somebody who has a connection.
Right.
So our lives should not be our lives, who we vote for, who we elect, how we heal this crisis. None of that should be related to our opportunities, our privilege, and who we're connected to.
Yeah. I was remembering there have been times in the past when it's been a political argument to say, why would we invest in new software upgrades in government when that'll just become obsolete and by the time we implement it. And so, Carolyn's point is really well taken. People need support folks. Our gains in having, good healthcare outcomes, generally good outcomes for people in our government programs, relies on wraparound services and people having, as much support as they need. And those are all in jeopardy with the budget cuts that we're facing. So this is a more important time than ever to keep saying it's not just about, it's true, it's not just about the information in other languages. Friends of mine are on the phone with those folks, and, having gone through some of those applications myself, then they'll say, oh, okay, well, yeah, you just need to print it out and sign it. And I'm saying, okay, I don't think it's just because I'm a millennial, I'm the only one who doesn't have a printer right now. Where am I supposed to go to do that? So I called Bernie's office and said, could you get them to change the wet ink requirement on some of these forms? I mean, the barriers are endless for people. And we're going to need folks, to be that support system for people. And that is absolutely in jeopardy with some of the budget cuts. So we're going to have to be advocating. I remember, starting in the legislature in the pre-fall of the Great Recession in 2009. And, I think some of the most valuable emails we got were people saying, this is the kind of work I do and I really value it, but I don't think it's as important as a person with a disability getting an aid right now, who otherwise can't communicate. So people were really in it together. This work is really important. Please fund that. Those are refreshing. I mean, Mari, Representative Mari Cordes is on the line. I think sometimes, we really pull together and say, what is important? What are the people most vulnerable, who are most vulnerable need? And this is, the beginning of another probably deep economic recession. And we're going to have to figure out what services we really value as a state.
Yeah, just to follow up. Oh, were you going to say something, Brenda?
No, I'd rather hear from you.
I was going to say, just to follow up, one thing that I think that we could use, and this is pretty proactive thought, but I would love to see like a statewide accommodation plan. So for example, if anyone actually, I mean, obviously we'd have to scale this way up, but this is something that I've thought about for a while. Why don't we actually have a statewide accommodation plan? I know that we follow our federal guidelines and things like that because we have to by law, but I would love to see a proactive and statewide accommodation plan that follows this COVID response. And I think it's something that we could totally do and that is within our wheelhouse to do because we are a small state. And I think this is one area that we could be a little bit more revolutionary, and we could really be a trendsetter, right? And so just looking at like what are the big colleges doing when they have to create these huge systems to manage these plethora of accommodations. Oh, an accommodation plan. I see somebody down there in the chat writing. I can't see the big chat box, so little things just pop up. So, but an accommodation plan, pretty much, speaking from the ground level, is something that happens maybe at the collegiate level or maybe even in the K through 12 level, where you have someone who actually has like a disability of some sort or a group of people who have a common disability, and so what you do is you create a plan that is specifically for this group or maybe even this individual that helps them get access in a way that is equitable. And a lot of times we only think about that on a small scale, but I think that in times like this, we have the opportunity to think about it on a larger scale.
So I think that we are about to switch interpreters, and so I'm giving that a second. Bye, Corey. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
And we are switching to Judy Kanoy, and now we're ready to do that. And I just wanted to say that people who are coming on right now or are leaving because they're tired, you can watch the whole thing. We will have it up. And also there's people watching again in Progressive Insider, in our YouTube, maybe in Progressive Insider's Facebook page, our Facebook page, other Facebook pages. If you still want to join in so you can actually ask questions in real time, feel free to do that. We do try to make it as accessible as possible and put it in as many places as possible, but we are only monitoring some of those spaces for questions. So I know that lots of people don't, in our events, lots of people don't come in and watch other ways, and they watch throughout the week, but we want to make sure that we are answering questions because later we don't have the same experts here to answer the questions. So when you type them in, I may not have the answers. And so I just want to say that it's not too late to come in. We'll put the sign in in the Brenda Siegel for Vermont Facebook page and in this, well, we won't put it in the chat because that doesn't matter. But if anybody shared it, if they want to, once we put the sign in. So anyways, there's that. And this conversation has been really incredible. It's been, I think that we have, I think we're really covering some things that we often don't cover. It's a dense topic because we always are leaving it out there. And something that Keisha said when we were talking about, like, this is important to me, I really want to fund this. I think that part of the reason we need this people's bailout or to center people going forward when we rebuild, we need to build better, is because it's so intersectional. All these issues are actually extremely intersectional, right? I think that that so many people do not have access to services. So many people do not have access to events like these because they don't have internet, or if we did not have an interpreter tonight, we did not last week for deaf and hard of hearing.
And I think we do have to work really hard to fix that. But part of that is to really own out loud that there's an intersectionality to all of these issues, and none of them exists alone, and we're not solving any of these problems if we don't solve all of these, which to some can feel daunting, but to me it's very exciting because I feel like we have an opportunity right now in this moment, we have this opportunity to I saw a meme that had an empty shell, and it said rebuilding our society in the shell of the society that once was. And I think we could really go very wrong if we just try to go back to normal. I don't even know what that is anymore. And instead, we could rebuild our society in the shell of what COVID-19 left. So that's just my 2 cents on that. I want to invite people to ask questions, and please feel comfortable asking anything. And whatever thoughts, because I do think that one of the things that happens is people do not understand these topics necessarily and then feel uncomfortable asking the questions, are not sure if it's okay, and that's why we're here. So please do ask. And while we are waiting to see if anybody has any questions, I want to bring up specifically the economic impact of COVID-19 and see if we can talk a little bit about what that really looks like. I touched on a little bit people having to go back to work because they aren't going to be able to get unemployment and maybe feeling unsafe. But there's also this whole deeper economic impact. And even if we stay evictions through July, or through the end of the crisis, what do people do when the crisis is over to catch up on all that rent? So that's not realistic to think people can come up with thousands of dollars suddenly at the end of all of that. And so really having a broader conversation about what the deeper economic impact is and how that's going to disproportionately, including in our state, but across the country, impact communities of color and other marginalized groups. We'll get to the question that just came up in a minute. I'm assuming it came from Facebook. But Stefan, do you want to start?
Yeah, can you repeat just that last part of the question again?
Just the disproportionate, how this economic impact of COVID-19 is going to disproportionately impact communities of color and other marginalized groups, and what we might do to center to have an honest discussion about that, and maybe center our policy in preparation rather than reactive policy going forward later, and rather than ending up with a bunch of homeless people experiencing homelessness and other catastrophic emergencies.
Well, I think the first thing is to realize that we don't have all the answers and that we need to be okay with that. I think that everyone is rushing to explain away an issue that we have not faced in a long time. I mean, it's been many years since we had a pandemic at this level. Most people that are alive, they don't remember something like this, right? So it's new for everyone, and I think that there needs to be the understanding that we probably will continue to see, and will see impacts to people of color, predominantly Black folks, especially Black people, for years to come from this, right? Especially economically. I would say to our lawmakers and the people who have some sort of political sway or sphere of influence, it's important now to be connecting with your grassroots organizations. If you're not in Vermont, looking at, because I know we don't have it here yet, hopefully we will one day, but like groups like 100 Black Men, right? Your Divine Nine fraternities and sororities, different groups like that. Here in Vermont, we do have, of course, the NAACP, we have Black Lives Matter, we have the Root, we have a lot of different grassroots organizations that are hearing stories from people of color, or that are just full of people of color who are living through these experiences and experiencing these barriers. So the first and foremost for me, and I love to keep answers, sort of simple and low to the floor is what I call it, so it's accessible, but I would love for people to get on the ground, and these lawmakers need to do that, and they need to be going and saying, okay, so like how we're setting up a Zoom now to talk about these issues, just having a conversation, really, the same thing could be happening reaching out to, grassroots leaders and saying, hey, can you get a few of your friends or a few people that you know have been impacted, and having these real conversations, because I don't want us to forget that oral history is important to our communities and that a lot of people are using them right now to share experiences. And so I think that could couple with a lot of the stuff that we're getting now from our data to really create a good picture of what is going on the ground. So for me, that is the biggest thing that we could do economically. I would also say that understanding that people of color have a completely different process. I have spoken to quite a few different folks from different racial backgrounds that have tried to go and get treatment and that have been turned away. Black women are treated horribly by our healthcare system. That is systemic. It happens everywhere. And we're seeing horror stories all over the place of Black women dying because of lack of treatment. I mean, I just saw one, I think it was out of Chicago, but don't quote me on that. But I think it was out of Chicago about a Black nurse who had worked at a hospital like plenty of years and got COVID, which had just retired, got it, tried to go back, and was denied access to the very hospital which she served and saved lives, and then she died, So the process is different, and a lot of people give up along the way, right? If I'm already feeling horribly and I keep getting turned away, then I'm not going to go back. But on the other side, a lot of our employers and a lot of employers, from what I've heard, this is anecdotal, we don't have the data yet, it's part of the problem, are sending people who maybe don't have COVID because they're sick to the hospital, therefore exposing them, right? So we need to be looking at the policies around how you actually deal with someone who does become sick, and actually figuring out if these jobs are following them, because if these employees are following them, because a lot of them aren't. So I think when we talk about economic impacts, it's really about the process and the story, and understanding that it's different than some of us who may be sitting in places of privilege experience, and that we're all connected in that, and that even if there is a person who is marginalized, say for example Indigenous, Black, something like that, that are experiencing these that are maybe are not experiencing like the COVID-19 virus themselves, they're probably systemically impacted because a family member, friends, something like that, one of those people are experiencing the virus. And that has been my experience as well. I have had people in my circle who have been economically impacted and socially impacted by COVID-19, even though none of them have actually gotten COVID-19.
Keisha, if you want to take that, you can as well.
Yeah, so, before the Great Recession and after the Great Recession and before now, we kept hearing that over half of Americans are one crisis away from bankruptcy and ruin and, have no wealth capacity to tolerate an emergency. And it just hit for everyone at the same time.
So, it's really similar with small businesses. They don't have even a month's worth of cash flow. And these are these workers and these businesses are the backbone of our economy. The problems getting access to capital were huge before, and the wealth gap was incredibly severe and will probably only get worse. If you can't, use your home as collateral right now to get a loan, if you have no savings and you already had poor credit, you're not getting very much help in this situation. And in fact, if you can't navigate the federal government's forms and systems right now, you might not even get your $1,200 or your money for your children. They have made it incredibly difficult for people even to get that emergency money, and it's just a symptom of what's happening in the country, that people who don't need the money are getting it, and having to potentially send checks back, and people who are desperately trying to figure out how to access it can't. We have to close the wealth gap. I know that's really huge, but in the meantime, I'm just trying to raise awareness with folks about who they're going to hear from soon and who they're not going to hear from. People who are struggling are not going to be able to be part of Zoom calls or on boards or telling people what's going on in their lives and getting help. They're just going to be dealing with the crisis that they're in. And so, my whole mantra is often just like, who needs to be paid and how do I get them paid? How do I, pay people for sharing their experience of this crisis? How can I pay people to serve on a board? If anyone, is part of an organization right now, you should be compensating people as much as you can to share their expertise and information to the divide between who can quote unquote volunteer and who deserves to be paid because they add value to a governing body or a board. I mean, we should just be really rethinking how people can participate in civic life, and how those of us who were privileged not to lose our shirt or our home or be completely um, lost in this crisis can help find resources for people who have been through it, get them their heads above water, and then figure out how to close the wealth gap and completely transform the economic situation for folks, because it's really unsustainable. It goes to the people's bailout. It's just incredibly unsustainable for everyone to be this close to financial ruin, every time they step out the door, which their crisis might have been personal with healthcare, um, on having an accident or getting sick, but this is everyone's healthcare crisis, and no one is safe. I hate that we have to bring it back to, even if you're healthy and privileged, why should you care about people who aren't? But public health crises remind us that there's no escaping a country where people are treated so badly that they're getting sick. That will eventually come back to your doorstep. Um, I hope people get that message in this crisis. But we know that there are those in power who are really good at exploiting crises to further enrich some and take away from others. And we have to be more vigilant than ever in making sure that doesn't happen.
And I want to name something that I think happens a lot, and is that people do host events like these, actually quite a lot, about centering communities of color, centering voices of people of color, and in fact, the Women's March did it this year, and of less white women showed up for the Women's March, where we had really incredible speakers. I mean, Representative Summer Lee spoke and was unbelievable. I mean, I tears in my eyes because she talked about running in poverty, which is something that I've never really been able to talk about. I've not had been able to commiserate about that experience with a lot of folks. And I've commiserated about it a little bit with Kaya Morris, but I have not been able to really talk about what that experience was. And so some of these experiences are very different, and some of them are shared experiences. And we lose a lot when we don't show up for this kind of conversation, and the kind of conversations that were had at the Women's March. And so I do want to, I guess, ask us all to tell our friends and say, hey, this is really important stuff, and we need to be part of this conversation. We need to be part of this solution because it impacts all of us. And even if it didn't, I mean, I personally want to help where I have privilege and others do not, anyways. But even if that's not where you're at right now, it is going to, like Keisha just said, it is going to jump back and impact all of us in the end. And I think that I often think about how I'm very resourceful, and I often think about I've never felt more food insecure than I felt in the beginning of this crisis as a low income person. I was very fearful that money was going to run out, and the amount of food that me and my child were going through, because there was no school eating at school, because there was no grabbing a bagel, and cream cheese, because there was none of that. The amount of food we are going through in our house is kind of unbelievable. We've never gone through food like this. I'm grateful that there's a shelter nearby. I'm grateful that I happen to know the person who lives near me, and so before there was delivery out to my house, I could get it delivered, because I was quarantined, because I possibly had COVID at one point. And I think that there is I think that there is a real need to understand, again, as Keisha said, who we're not going to hear from, because uh, it is unreasonable to expect. I remember people saying, well, if you want a livable wage, more people need to communicate with their legislators. I say, okay, but how? Like they can call, they can email, but how do we get to those? Like, why aren't the legislators going to the communities where this might impact and asking, what do you want? What do you need? How are we going to help you? And I think a lot of that, as Stefan was saying, getting out of hearing the voices of the people who are impacted and asking them what they need, because we often are very patronizing in that we are like, I'm going to help lift people out, and instead of saying like, let's work to, I want to hear from you and I want you to tell me uh, what you need right now, and as Keisha was saying, and figure out how to pay people in these settings. I mean, I often people in poverty can't necessarily show up at the state house and miss a day of work to testify on an issue that who live 2 hours away. So, so we do want, or go to Washington. You know, we're very grateful for many opportunities through Rights and Democracy and People's Action, other organizations that will pay the expenses for you to be able to go do that work. However, you still have to miss work. So there's still those other pieces. So figuring out how to really center those issues. I'm really glad you both brought those up. I want to go over. Does anybody have? I have the information, but I wanting to talk less in general tonight, and so uh, somebody is asking, probably from Facebook. May I have someone go over the people's bailout?
Can I just add really quickly too that to your point, Brenda, that we need to have a conversation about onus and who the onus is actually on. And when we hear statements like, well, we reached out to them, blah, 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 that it's essentially putting the onus on the backs of the people who are supposed to be represented to do the work. And that's not exactly how this is, how our system was intended to work and how it should be working. And if we are a state that is, resting on these laurels of being progressive, then we need to be acting progressively and putting the onus on ourselves, especially the lawmakers and policymakers, to be reaching out to these communities. And if you have to ask yourself why I can't get in touch with these communities, or if you have to say, well, I tried, but I couldn't figure out an avenue in, then maybe you should ask yourself why that is. Because a lot of people do have avenues in and they are accessing these communities.
Yeah, I want to echo that, because I definitely spend much of my life trying to figure out how I'm going to engage with communities that and I'm willing to do the work to get there, and it's very hard work, and I don't think but that's, I am trying to run for office, and I am, even if I wasn't, I am trying to be a community organizer, a community leader, and if that's what I'm about, then I have to do that. I have to be willing to be on the ground and willing to do that work. If I'm not, if I don't respond to emails, if I'm not willing to go to those communities, if I'm not willing to do any of that work, then I don't think I'm really representing those. I can't, because I haven't heard from them, and now I'm just guessing, and guessing is not appropriate. So yeah, that's what I want to say about that.
So yeah, I'm happy to try and address the question about the people's bailout. I think it's an important one, and there are a lot of different efforts that people are trying to get off the ground as we figure out, and especially as we react to just really disheartening, discouraging news out of Washington. And as I think one of the first discouraging pieces of news was actually among very many, having the White House and the president fire a watchdog who was supposed to help us figure out how $2 trillion were going to be spent in the first place. So, as we pump trillions of dollars now into the economy, and now there's the website up at peoplesaction.org, People's Bailout Principles. The deep dismay is that it's just making obvious that our system was set up to further enrich people who weren't ever experiencing the crisis in the first place. That you can give a lot of money to corporations that don't support their workers, that don't help people get back to work, but use it for stock buybacks, et cetera. So there are principles of the people's bailout that fall along the lines of, I think the most obvious, everyone should have access to healthcare. This should show us deeply how much healthcare is a right, and we all rely on a good the society built on strong public health. It includes both short-term and long-term recovery. So as money gets, pumped back into the economy, who's it going to? How do we get it directly to the people most in need and the communities that deserve it, rather than corporations and executives? Um, Additionally, what does this say about our food system? How do we invest in a system of well-being and quality food, you look at the workers who are being forced back to work in meat packing plants, and just those are some of our food service workers are our worst off folks. So how do we create a just food system that is nourishing for us? um, and gosh, I think, oh yes, right, one that's very important right now as we think about even how our elections are going to take place in Vermont. But how do we protect the integrity of our democracy at this time? We do have people in power who have a history of using crises, as I said, to erode access to the vote and safe, healthy access to the vote. And we saw what happened in Wisconsin, that now there are people infected and sick just for going out to exercise their very important right to vote, to pick a new judge. So how do we make sure that this is really supporting our democracy? And I think wrapped up in that, and I don't want it to get lost, is protecting the postal service and our mail system, which will be an incredibly important resource to make sure that we get ballots or absentee voter request forms, or with the right information, or access to resources or things, medicine that we need. We just need a really strong postal service, and that also is in jeopardy.
So I think that our rural communities are, what you just brought up, the postal service. Our rural communities are really impacted by the postal service. If the postal service were to disappear, and in Vermont, and so that's another, and it will impact our elections. And so it's a really great way to shut down people's voices, people who maybe don't have access to the internet or phones. It's a really excellent way to make sure people can't get the information they need, or can't have no communication. That's And so it's pretty disappointing. That's a nice word I'll use, to hear our the person in charge in the White House go ahead and say that that's okay, that funding going away is okay, because it really deeply impacts those same communities that he made promises to in the during the election in 2016. And so but it will definitely disproportionately impact, again, communities of color, which have been under attack for a long, long time. I do not want there to be any. I really do. I'm really cautious to say that while there has been a rise in the openness of racism and anti-Semitism, and fascism in general, and xenophobia, to some extent, since the election of Donald Trump, it is not new. It has been here. So I want to be really cautious to say that there was a already fertile ground for this for this rise to happen when he was elected. And so we do have to. If I don't think we won't fix the problem by electing a new person. I mean, we must elect a new person. We will not fix the problem by electing the new person. We can't stop there. We have to make sure that we move forward. So I do want to say that as well. Um, uh, and I want to give people I want to give Stefan, if you want to, any either of you, if you want to have anything to say, and we're going to give people a few minutes to ask questions, and then we are going to wrap it up pretty soon. We also have a hard stop a little bit later because our producer has another show. So, so we're gonna give people. I'm gonna give Stefan and Keisha, if you both have anything to add to the people's bailout question. If other folks have questions, please ask them now. And we just had someone come in too, so please do ask questions if you have them. We do want to hear them.
I just wanted to say too, I think this in general, whether people feel comfortable asking questions or not, it speaks to, something that I did a little bit of writing about and reflecting, which is our worlds have gotten even a little bit smaller than they were before, which is okay. There's something to be said for, just knowing who you can turn to in a crisis, who gives you comfort or um, you know, some sense of what you need to get through this. And at the same time, trying to have new conversations and connect with new people is going to be really important if we want to come out of this stronger or with ideas to shift paradigms and move forward. We just have to know more people's experiences to be able to do that well. So every once in a while, even if we're zoomed out, we're like being zoomed to death, just trying to meet a new person, have a new conversation. Those kind as Carolyn is doing, calling people and having a conversation about what they might need, that will just give you a window into other people's lives. And I think that um, is important. And, I think Stefan and I are friendly people in case anybody wants to follow up and really understand these issues better. But I've been really impressed. I've been on, a number of calls where I just wasn't expecting someone to bring up disparities, and they did, and I didn't have to be the one to do it. So, the more folks who just are the ones to talk about these deep inequities that are being experienced, who come from a place of privilege and are still able to say that, you're really making a difference, just by being the ones to speak up. So we don't have to, especially what Stefan said about being exhausted and having your quality of life and your mental health affected. You just have to pick your battles very carefully, and so having some help on the front lines is really valuable.
Yeah, and I think that I want to just say that I've never heard us talk about disparities and racial disparities and economic injustice and injustice in our prison systems on mainstream media. The way that I have watched, I don't ever turn on my TV, and I have watched the news several times, not because I'm wanting to get the news about COVID, because I'm actually astounded hearing them spit out progressive like policy needs, and I'm like, what's happened? I've had like, we've been screaming this from the rooftop, and suddenly they're like, as if it was always something they said, they're talking about the racial disparities that have always been there and the economic disparities and how this is impacting COVID and what opening up is going to do to poor people and what I'm like, and housing issues. And I'm like, I I mean, we've been saying that, and it's amazing to hear that I've actually listened for long periods of time because I'm so astounded by the sudden feeling. It feels sudden for them to suddenly be talking about it in a way that we've hoped they would for a long time. I mean, still not enough, but even just that's amazing. Um and and again, also on calls and also in social media, and we're saying it differently now. The number of people who shows up for a May Day rally that was specifically about a people's bailout and tenants' rights and something different than just than what it always is about. It wasn't just about workers' rights, which, because the reality is again that tenants' rights and people's bailout, that's all about everything, that it's all intersectional. And so it's really important that we do name the people that are showing up right now and ask you to not stop showing up as we start to move forward. And also, I'm going to ask you to wear masks and socially distance, because I do see people coming lax, and again, that's going to negatively impact the people who have to go back to work and be in those workspaces with you, or when you're buying something from them in a retail store. So I think that I've heard several times workers really feel worried and frustrated about that. Um, so I want to, I usually, and it's funny, I did not do it in the beginning, but we do have a donation link for anyone who wants to donate. Before, we're going to continue this conversation for a few more minutes, and then we're going to let folks go. But I have a donation link. If you donate, it goes evenly to Keisha, who's running for Trenton County Senate, and myself, who's running for Lieutenant Governor. So please consider donating. And also, I believe, Keisha, do you have a website that that people can go to if they wanted to volunteer?
I sure do. www.kesharam.com, KESHARAM. And yeah, I just think we're all doing what we can as candidates to connect people and be a resource. And so that is another way I think to create connective tissue. Certainly, no one's out just sort of ignoring these issues or campaigning without just thinking about how we can be of great service to our neighbors right now.
And us as well. We are, oh, that's not the right spelling. So I'll let Keisha probably put it in, I imagine. Yeah, she's going to put it in right now, Carolyn. And then also you can go to my website, brendaforvermont.com, and you can sign up to volunteer or for our mailing list. And we definitely we're in a statewide race, so we need lots of volunteers and text banking. And we are coming to your community soon virtually. And we will do a couple different ways so that we can make sure everybody is contacted. I am going to let everybody close up. I think that so as Keisha was saying, we are zoomed out as a society right now. I've seen a couple people post something like, after this, can we never talk about Zoom again? and But in some ways, this has been really great. So, to have these opportunities. And one of the reasons that we offer this throughout the next, like, it's always up on our page, and throughout the next week, we'll really make sure it's widely spread, is so that people have an opportunity to watch it when is comfortable for them. So we want to have these conversations. But if both Keisha and Stefan are okay with it, we can put up your contact information as well, so people can ask you questions. If you're not, it's also okay. So, because I kind of just put you on the spot. Um, and then I'll let you both say some closing. Is it okay with you, Stefan, to put up your contact info?
Yes, you can put up, and if you don't have it, I'll send you my personal email, which I'm okay with people knowing it because obviously the NAACP is nonpartisan, so I can't necessarily connect anything I do. If I'm having a community conversation, it has to come to me. But I'm totally happy to field any questions that way.
Okay, so I think that's great that we're going to have those, and folks that were on or are watching on Facebook, if you've signed in, or if you sign in through our website, if you go to brendaforvermont.com and have leave contact us, and tell us that you were there and you want to get the information. We do then send like a summary follow-up with the resources that we shared tonight, and we send that to everyone, including folks that were interested but unable to attend because of the time or whatever, and make sure that they have the link to this as well to watch. So that's all will be available.
My
Stefan?
personal email is just my first and last name at yahoo.com. I apologize, I didn't mention that before. All lowercase.
That's okay. So I am gonna give each of you a chance to just close. Is that the right spelling?
Oh, I can't see the chat. Yeah, whatever it says on my little box is the correct spelling, so
Okay. Okay. Um, okay. So I'm gonna give each of you a chance to just close and say what you want us to know, just as we're ending, and we are going to shift our time a little early. Well, no, we're not, because it's getting lighter out later. So, so that was just a thought that passed through my head out loud. So I am really grateful that you both attended and came, and I'll just say goodbye at the end. But I really do want our real final words to come from all of you. And what I will say is that I'm committed 100% to bringing these historically marginalized voices and conversations, and centering what we do in policy going forward uh, around the needs of historically marginalized groups, because I do think that that's what best serves all of us, and I do think that these groups have been left out of the conversation just far too often. Go ahead, Stefan.
okay, I will keep it short and sweet. So, first of all, I just want to say thank you for inviting me to this community conversation. One thing about Zoom that is great is that we're able to connect just with people from up and down the state, which is remarkable because I don't think there would ever have been a time, well, maybe, but it would have been a long time coming that Keisha and I would have been able to be in the same space. And so it's always good just to connect, from the south to the north. So that's wonderful. Obviously I'm just here as myself, but everyone knows in the state that I'm also part of the NAACP. So if there's anything local in Windham County that's going on that you think I should know about on a civil rights, in the civil rights field, lens, whatever, like, please do be in contact with me. And we have a website. It's still under construction, but it's up. And that's Windham County NAACP.org. Or if you just type it into Google, we'll pop right on up. And so you can contact us that way. And we have all of our emails on there. I would say that my final words are just, in coming to these community conversations, I love and I always try to just have to speak from the heart and have a conversation that I think is accessible. And I think that for me, the biggest piece of accessibility is remembering that the onus is on us in positions of power that have spheres of influence to be able to reach out to communities who are marginalized, right? Right now, we talk about people of color, but I think it's also important to be naming Black people, to be naming Latinx people, to be naming Asian people, because they are experiencing their own types of discrimination that are unique to their communities, especially African American or Black with a capital B, African descended folks who are really being hit hard by this. And I would also say that it's important that we pay attention to those historical legacies, right? We're having these wonderful conversations, but they're built on a lot of pain and a lot of people's backs who are no longer here anymore. And a lot of those families that now have to deal with intergenerational trauma that's going to last for the next 20 or 30 years, and a renewed sense of mistrust in a lot of our systems that was already there and that is now here again to stay, from the mental health side of things, the clinical side of things, to the medical side of things, to just things like basic government resources. I think we've seen now that our taxes might not be going towards or might not be helping us in the ways that we thought they would, especially as folks of color. And I think it's important when we go forward and we use our spheres of influence to create those policies and to influence these laws or actually be part of the lawmaking process, to remember that and to be reaching back. So that's pretty much all I have to say. And I will hit this dandy little mute button and let Keisha go on and say whatever it is that she wants to say.
Thanks so much, Stefan. And I just really, really value your work and your tireless perspective that we need to keep reaching back and making sure we're not leaving others behind. I think I think it's always been part of a mythology that's getting a little tired, that out of crises we sort of all come together and we, move forward. But I'm just a little bit worried in this one about how quickly we've been able to be divided as a nation. And um, even in places where we think we are one community in Vermont, it feels like, well, I got mine and I don't want to rock the boat. I don't want to speak up for prisoners. I don't want to speak up for migrant farm workers. There's, a debate going on in the legislature right now about support for, undocumented folks who otherwise won't get any economic relief and are the backbone of our dairy industry. So, you know, what does it look like to believe in that American mythology that we can come out of this somehow more united? Um, it's going to be hard to do, but it's worth holding on to, and it's worth thinking, if I can help the least among us, the most vulnerable, the people that will be hardest hit, um, will be stronger as a nation for it. And I run for office because I still believe in this country, and I believe that it can be better. And I hope we all hold on to that and do our best to make that a reality and to live that. Because if we can't think of one another in a crisis like this, we're in trouble. So, I would love to believe that we can come out of this stronger, and it's going to take a lot of hard work and continuing these conversations and taking action to support those who otherwise would be left behind.
I want to thank both of you for attending. My heart is very warmed by this conversation. I'm really excited that it's going to be available and that people can watch it on the time that they have and are available to do it, because I think that there's been incredible. I think this conversation has been an incredible opening. Not that it's never been had before, but just you both brought just really not just knowledge, but and not just empathy, but real what paths forward into this conversation, and a real starting place for us to really to build from. And I agree with you both so much, and you're both I reach out to both of you regularly for opinions about issues around this and many other things, and I really value what you bring to the table. You, Stefan, as you, and and also as the Windham County NAACP, and also Keisha as just you, and as a candidate as well. And I think that that's really important. So I want to just thank you for attending and coming, and thank you for those of you that watched on all the Facebooks and Progressive Insiders YouTube and potentially our YouTube, and also who came in as attendees here, and I'm grateful that the opening was made for this conversation. I hope to have many more just like this. Oh, and next week we're going to have a conversation uh, on the public education system, and including our Vermont state colleges, and why we need to talk about those as a unit, not separately. And we're going to have quite a lot of panelists at that event, and and we're looking forward to it. And you can join us tomorrow. You can watch it live on Facebook and see my son and I cook together and cooking with Ajna, which is really taken off in this state. And is quite funny because it's definitely mom son time. So I want to thank you all for joining us for the issue-based events and for the fun events that we've had. And we have many more coming up. And thank you both for attending.
Thank you.
Bye. And as you two can, I think we'll stop recording probably. It looks like we did. And I just want to thank you guys separately.